whack, early Victor bang, lean, bang, shoulder, and bop.
Every single time Michael Jackson stepped under those stadium lights, it looked effortless, like the moves simply arrived the moment the music started. That was the illusion, and it was a carefully engineered one. What almost nobody saw were the empty rehearsal rooms, the freezing cold sound checks, the bruised ankles, and the thousands of silent repetitions that happened long before a single spotlight ever hit him. Over the years, scattered pieces of that hidden process have leaked out: grainy home videos, private studio recordings, backstage camera rolls never meant for public release. Stitched together, they tell a completely different story than the polished performances everyone grew up watching. Today we're walking through that hidden timeline, year by year, room by room, all the way from a teenager sweating through basic jazz steps to the most commanding performer a stadium stage had ever seen. By the end, you'll understand that the magic wasn't magic at all. It was obsession, repeated in private until nobody could tell the difference anymore. What's genuinely strange watching this footage back to back is how consistent the pattern is. Almost none of these clips show a moment of natural talent simply arriving. Every single one shows the exact opposite: a performer deliberately breaking something down into its smallest possible piece, testing it alone, adjusting it, and only bringing it out once it had been quietly perfected somewhere nobody was watching. That pattern starts earlier than most fans realize, more than a decade before Thriller ever existed. Our story starts in 1978, inside a cramped, dusty rehearsal space nobody would ever mistake for a concert stage. This is where a teenage Michael, dressed in nothing more than plain sweatpants and a worn t-shirt, worked alongside choreographer Louis Johnson to prepare for his role as the Scarecrow in The Wiz. What survives from this period is quietly stunning. You can watch him deliberately throw his own balance off-center, letting his body tip dangerously to one side, only to snap back into a perfectly controlled position a split second later. He wasn't simply memorizing steps handed to him. He was studying how far a human body could bend before it stopped looking human at all, chasing a strange, expressive quality that had nothing to do with traditional technique. There's a moment in this footage where he repeats the exact same off-balance stumble more than a dozen times in a row, each attempt slightly different, slightly more controlled, until the movement finally looks like something a scarecrow with no bones might actually do. Nobody in that dusty room could have guessed they were watching the first draft of a global phenomenon quietly assembling itself in real time. Fast forward to 1981, and the setting shifts to a private rehearsal hall where the Jackson brothers are grinding through preparation for their upcoming Triumph tour. On paper, this was a group rehearsal, 5 brothers working through the same routine together. But watch closely and your eyes drift toward one performer almost immediately. While his brothers run the choreography as written, Michael keeps stopping the group, adjusting spacing, tightening transitions, experimenting with sharper, more percussive isolations that don't quite match the rest of the formation yet. At one point in the footage, he can be seen quietly counting out a rhythm under his breath, testing a variation nobody else in the room has attempted, before waving the group back to their starting marks to run it again from the top. It's an early, unmistakable glimpse of a director's instinct forming inside a performer who technically hadn't gone solo yet. Every stop, every correction, every repeated 8 count in that footage reads like a man quietly outgrowing the group he was standing in. By late 1982, the setting turns considerably stranger. Inside a dimly lit Los Angeles studio, surrounded by a rotating cast of audition dancers, Michael is working alongside choreographer Michael Peters on something the world hadn't seen attempted before, teaching human beings how to convincingly move like the dead. This is the earliest known footage connected to Thriller, and it captures something the finished video never fully shows: the trial and error of turning a genuinely ridiculous concept into something bone-chilling. Michael walks dancers through decayed, twisted postures, then demands they snap into tight rhythmic unison a beat later, blending horror with groove in a way choreography simply hadn't attempted at that scale before. At several points he physically demonstrates the exact angle he wants a shoulder dropped or a jaw slackened, stepping into the middle of a group of confused auditioning dancers to show them precisely what dead but danceable was supposed to look like. The famous shoulder shrugs and shuffling zombie walk look rough and unfinished here, still being pulled apart and rebuilt in real time, long before a single camera crew or dance captain locked the routine into place. Then comes a piece of footage so intimate it barely feels like it should exist at all. Filmed in early 1983 on a shaky home camera inside the Jackson family's private studio, this clip shows Michael completely alone, with no crew, no lighting rig, no audience of any kind. He is working through the choreography he'll perform just weeks later on the Motown 25th anniversary special, quietly building the backward glide that would eventually be known worldwide as the Moonwalk. Without the sequined glove, without a single spotlight, he relies purely on feel, sliding backward, stopping, resetting his weight, adjusting the precise timing of each heel lift, over and over, hunting for the exact motion that would make the illusion of walking backward while appearing to move forward look completely seamless. At one point, the footage catches him pausing entirely, staring down at his own feet for several long seconds, before resetting to the top and trying the exact same 8 count again, as though he already sensed how much would be riding on getting this specific detail right. There's no glamour anywhere in this footage. Just a young man alone in a room, quietly solving a puzzle that would reshape popular culture within the month. Move ahead to 1984, and the scale has changed entirely. This footage was captured from the back of a massive, echoing, completely empty arena during Victory Tour preparations. Dressed down in casual clothes and thick knee pads, Michael isn't performing here so much as stress testing the venue itself, running his signature spin into a toe stand hold again and again to judge exactly how the surface responds under his shoes. What makes this particular clip remarkable is the raw, unfiltered audio. You can hear him shouting real-time instructions to sound and lighting technicians between takes, adjusting a spotlight angle, requesting a tighter follow beam, treating an entire stadium like a private laboratory built exclusively for troubleshooting split-second details most audiences would never consciously register. There's a moment where he calls out for the follow spot to tighten by what sounds like inches, then immediately reruns the same spin sequence to check whether the adjustment actually solved the problem, an almost obsessive back and forth that repeats itself a dozen times before he's finally satisfied. By 1986, Michael found himself somewhere no performer had really gone before, on the tightly guarded set of Disney's ambitious 3D production Captain EO. This surviving footage shows him working through choreography while wearing a rough, unfinished prototype of his character's heavy spacesuit, a costume built for cinema, not for dancing. Surrounded by dancers dressed as alien creatures, he reworks his familiar popping vocabulary to survive the suit's added bulk and restricted range of motion, refusing to let the costume flatten his precision. The footage shows him stopping repeatedly to shake out his arms and shoulders, clearly fighting against fabric that was never designed with dance in mind, before finding small workarounds that let his signature isolations read clearly even through layers of restrictive padding. Watching him consult directly with the production team about camera angles and depth for the 3D format, it's clear he approached even a theme park attraction with the same relentless attention to detail he brought to a stadium tour. The year 1987 brought a complete image overhaul, and the surviving rehearsal footage from this period shows exactly how deliberate that transformation actually was. In one clip, filmed inside a mirror-lined studio alongside choreographer Jeffrey Daniel, Michael works through the confrontational subway face-off sequence that would define Bat's title track. Stripped of the heavily buckled leather jacket audiences would later see on screen, he practices in plain rehearsal clothes, obsessing almost entirely over sudden stops and abrupt shifts in body weight, the kind of details that read as pure attitude once the cameras finally rolled. He runs the same confrontational stare-down and jacket grab motion again and again, adjusting the exact half-second where his weight needs to snap backward for the gesture to land with real menace instead of looking staged. In a separate rehearsal from the same period, the focus shifts to pure ensemble precision, Michael drilling his backup dancers relentlessly on the way you make me feel, chasing perfect unison down to fractions of a second on a single forward foot slide. He moves through the sequence with an easy, joyful swagger, but his eyes never stop scanning the studio mirror, checking every dancer's alignment against his own, stopping the group cold the instant one dancer's foot lands a beat too early. One of the rarest surviving clips from this entire era captures something most fans never got to witness: the literal engineering test behind one of the most famous illusions in live performance history. Filmed inside a tightly secured workshop in late 1987, this footage shows the earliest prototype testing for the gravity-defying forward lean that would eventually define Smooth Criminal. Long before the specialized shoes and hidden floor mechanism were finalized, Michael had to figure out how to shift his entire center of gravity without simply falling flat on his face. Hooked into an early safety harness, he leans forward in careful, controlled increments, his expression locked in total concentration as he communicates directly with engineers about the strain building in his ankles and calves. Between attempts, you can hear quiet, clipped exchanges about the harness tension and how far the angle can safely push before his balance point fails completely, a genuinely tense negotiation between artistic ambition and basic human physics. It's a genuinely humbling reminder that behind one of the most magical-looking stunts in music history sat a small team of engineers and a performer willing to physically risk his own body to sell an illusion. Later that same tour, a completely different kind of footage surfaced. This one shot during a freezing afternoon soundcheck inside an empty Tokyo stadium. Bundled up in a heavy sweatshirt, thick sweatpants, and his signature fedora, with no audience anywhere in sight, Michael quietly works through the footwork for Rock With You, testing how the stage surface responds under his shoes before the crowd ever arrives. There's an almost meditative stillness to this clip, a performer humming softly to himself, gliding and stopping with effortless control, entirely unconcerned with being watched, because for once, almost nobody was. You can hear his breath fogging faintly in the cold arena air between takes, and at one point he simply stands still for several seconds, eyes closed, listening to the silence of an empty stadium that would be roaring with 60,000 voices in a matter of hours. An even more private moment survives from a cramped backstage dressing room in Pensacola during the American leg of the same tour. With no music playing at all, Michael warms up on a small sheet of plywood laid across the carpeted floor, relying entirely on internal rhythm to fire off rapid triple spins before locking into sharp, silent poses. You can hear his loafers striking the wood and his fingers snapping like small firecrackers in the otherwise silent room. His face carries an intensity that feels almost disproportionate to the size of the space he's working in. A man locked into total focus despite having nothing more than a few square feet of plywood and his own internal metronome. It's an unusually raw window into the private ritual a performer goes through moments before walking out to face tens of thousands of screaming strangers. Strangest of all might be a clip from 1989, filmed for an entirely different purpose altogether. To help sculpt an eerily lifelike wax figure, Michael endured an extended measurement session, standing under harsh studio lighting and holding some of his most iconic dance poses completely motionless for several minutes at a stretch. Watching him hold a dramatic toe stand or a sharply angled arm freeze without so much as a twitch, you realize how much raw physical control was required just to stay still, proof that even frozen, his presence carried the same dramatic weight as when he was mid-spin. Technicians can be seen circling him slowly with measuring tools and reference cameras, capturing the exact curve of a bent elbow or the precise tilt of his chin, treating his body less like a subject and more like a piece of architecture that needed to be documented down to the millimeter before it could ever be recreated in wax. In 1991, the footage takes on an entirely different tone. Inside a private studio, Michael sits not as the teacher but as the student, working directly with dancers trained in traditions completely outside his own background, absorbing rhythmic patterns rooted in Native American and South Asian dance forms as he prepared the vision behind Black or White. He experiments openly with blending these unfamiliar movements into his own sharp, syncopated style, laughing whenever he fumbles a step, then immediately resetting to try again. At one point he asks one of the visiting dancers to slow a particular foot pattern down and walk him through it a second time, watching intently before attempting it himself, a global icon happily positioning himself as the least experienced person in the room. The clip radiates genuine curiosity rather than performance, a global superstar quietly expanding his own vocabulary by listening to traditions far older than pop music itself. That same year, backstage chaos gives way to full command during rehearsal footage for the MTV 10th anniversary special. Surrounded by a massive gospel choir and a small army of backup performers, Michael repeatedly halts the music to adjust hand placement, timing, and even the emotional expression on individual performers' faces. Dressed casually in sunglasses and a simple jacket, he directs the entire room like a conductor, shaping what could have been an ordinary television performance into something that felt closer to a live testimony. He stops one section of the choir twice just to adjust the angle of their raised arms, insisting the gesture needs to look like genuine release rather than choreography, a small but telling detail about how much emotional precision mattered to him even in a segment most performers would treat as a throwaway television appearance. Early 1992 brought footage from an entirely different creative laboratory, a mirror-lined studio where Michael worked alongside choreographers Travis Payne and Lavelle Smith Jr. to build the mechanical, militaristic vocabulary that would define Dangerous. Working almost entirely in silence, broken only by rhythmic hand claps and the snap of neckties, the trio obsesses over precise geometric arm angles, endlessly adjusting the now legendary tie snap sequence one fractional movement at a time. At several points the footage shows them freezing mid-motion to argue quietly about whether an elbow should bend at 90 degrees or slightly less, a level of granular disagreement that sounds almost absurd until you see the finished routine and realize how much that tiny angle actually mattered to the overall visual line. Stripped of the sharp suits and dramatic lighting fans would later associate with the routine, this footage exposes the almost mathematical thinking underneath one of the most visually hypnotic dance sequences of his entire career. January 1993 delivered a moment that permanently changed what a halftime show could look like, and surviving daytime footage from an empty Rose Bowl reveals exactly how deliberately that moment was engineered. Rather than rehearsing a dance sequence, Michael stands completely motionless on a raised platform for a full 90 seconds, testing how his silhouette would register from the stadium's furthest, highest seats while camera operators map their angles around him. Nobody in that empty stadium says a word for most of the clip, just the faint sound of a director occasionally calling out camera positions while Michael holds his stance without so much as a shift in weight, treating absolute stillness with the same discipline he usually reserved for his most explosive choreography. It's a masterclass in a completely different discipline, understanding that stillness, held with total conviction in front of tens of thousands of people, can generate exactly as much tension as an explosive dance break. A separate clip from the same tour cycle strips away almost everything except his feet. Shot in extreme close-up on a dusty plywood rehearsal floor, this footage isolates the blistering heel-to-toe shuffle work behind the song Jam, his loafers blurring across the surface as he chases mathematical precision in his footwork, completely divorced from lighting, facial expression, or any of the usual visual spectacle. There's no wide shot in this clip at all, just feet, floor, and the sound of rapid contact repeating in an almost hypnotic loop, forcing your attention onto the sheer velocity of the movement rather than anything happening above the ankle. It's a hypnotic, almost clinical demonstration of pure technical skill. Then comes what many longtime fans consider the single greatest surviving rehearsal clip in his entire catalogue. Filmed privately in 1995 while preparing his medley for the MTV Video Music Awards, this footage shows Michael in plain black sweatpants delivering a version of the smooth criminal routine so fast and aggressive it arguably outclasses the broadcast performance that followed. With no cameras built for television and no audience to perform for, he lets go completely, snapping through the choreography with a ferocity that makes clear he never once treated an empty room as a lesser stage. His dancers can barely keep pace, several of them visibly straining to match a tempo that looks almost dangerously fast even by his own usual standards, and yet nothing about his own execution loses an ounce of precision. That same year produced something historic for an entirely different reason. Rare footage of Michael and his sister Janet rehearsing together on the stark white spaceship set built for Scream, at the time the most expensive music video ever produced. Dressed in comfortable rehearsal gear rather than the sleek costumes audiences would later see, the two siblings trade sharp, synchronized arm snaps and hip-hop inflected steps, occasionally breaking into genuine laughter between takes. At one point Janet playfully mimics an exaggerated version of one of her brother's signature poses, and he breaks character just long enough to laugh before immediately resetting into the routine, a brief, unscripted flash of sibling warmth buried inside an otherwise intensely disciplined session. Watching two of the most famous performers on the planet casually trading choreography notes like any other pair of dancers is a small, quietly powerful reminder of who they were before the cameras started rolling. In 1996, Michael pushed his physical artistry somewhere genuinely unsettling with the short film Ghosts. Rehearsal footage from this period shows him in ordinary clothes, using pure popping and locking technique to simulate the illusion of bones cracking and moving independently beneath his skin. No visual effects, no post-production trickery, just isolated muscle control creating something deeply eerie to watch. He works through isolating his ribs, hips, and neck with disturbing precision, treating his own body as the special effect long before any digital work was layered on top. Watching the raw footage without the finished film's makeup and lighting is almost more unsettling than the final version, a reminder of just how much of the horror in that sequence came from technique rather than from any camera trick layered on afterward. A separate, lesser-known clip from that same creative period reveals an entirely different version of Too Bad that never made the final cut, a looser, more street-level groove built around fluid body rolls and mid-90s hip-hop influence rather than the sharper choreography audiences eventually saw. Working alongside a small group of dancers rather than his usual full ensemble, he tries out several different variations of the same 8 count in a row, clearly testing which version feels more natural against the track before ultimately setting it aside entirely. Watching this alternate version, you can almost picture an entirely different music video existing in some parallel timeline, one built around a completely different rhythmic feel. It's a quiet but valuable reminder that even brilliant routines sometimes got discarded in pursuit of something that fit even better. Our journey closes inside a massive, echoing airplane hangar in 1996, where Michael directs dozens of newly recruited dancers through the militaristic marching sequence built for They Don't Care About Us. Using the hangar's enormous natural acoustics to judge exactly how synchronized footsteps would land on an audience, he repeatedly halts the drill to correct timing down to fractions of a second, orchestrating an enormous human formation with the discipline of a commanding officer rather than a choreographer. At one point, the entire group runs the same 16-count march 4 times in a row simply because a handful of footsteps in the back row landed a fraction of a beat late, a level of demand that would exhaust most performers half his age, delivered here by a man well into his 3rd decade of doing exactly this, night after night, room after room, for as long as anyone could remember. That's the hidden timeline behind the performer the entire world thought it already knew, nearly 2 decades of freezing sound checks, silent bedroom floors, engineering workshops, and obsessive repetition, almost none of it ever meant for public eyes. Every flawless spin you watched on a stadium screen had a version of this footage sitting behind it somewhere, unglamorous, exhausting, and endlessly repeated until it looked like it required no effort at all. What's striking, looking back across all of it, isn't just the sheer volume of practice. It's how little that practice ever resembled what the public eventually saw. A teenager throwing himself off balance in a dusty rehearsal hall doesn't look like a global icon in the making. A man alone on a home video, quietly resetting his feet again and again, doesn't look like he's about to redefine an entire art form in front of 47 million television viewers. A performer standing frozen and silent for 90 seconds in an empty football stadium doesn't look like the most electrifying entertainer of his generation. And yet every one of those unglamorous, unremarkable-looking moments turned out to be the actual foundation underneath every performance the world eventually fell in love with. The polish everyone remembers was never the real story. The real story was always happening quietly, off-camera, in a room nobody was supposed to see inside of. Which one of these hidden rehearsals surprised you the most? Tell us down in the comments, and if this pulled back the curtain in a way you weren't expecting, stay close, because there's still more locked away in the archives waiting to be found.